And we've now gone from the manufacturing age to the human capital age. I think the US, by the personality of its people, by its entrepreneurial spirit, by having the freedom of the internet, which you don't have in a place like China, to share ideas. I think the US is in an unbelievable position in the new world. So no, I don't think we are losing our hegemonic position. I think it's actually been strengthened. I also think it's been strengthened with the dollar being the reserve currency and the dollar being the currency that most of the world trades in. The Federal Reserve now has become almost like the world's central bank or the world's firehouse. Now, I think the one thing that could seriously change this, if Donald Trump becomes elected,
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig. Since the end of World War I, and especially World War II, the United States has been the anchor of the liberal world order, shaping international institutions, promoting democratic values, and driving economic globalization. This role, often referred to as that of a liberal hegemon, has been critical not only for maintaining relative global peace, but also for establishing a framework of international cooperation, trade, and diplomacy. It's a role that has cemented American influence, both soft and hard power, across the globe. But what happens if this leadership falters or takes a sharp inward turn? What if the United States no longer even wants to lead? Under the presidency of Donald Trump, we saw a glimpse of what a withdrawal from international alliances and multilateral agreements could look like. His America First doctrine intended to pull the U.S. back from its leadership role, fostering a form of isolationism at odds with nearly a century of American foreign policy. Now, with the possibility of Trump's return to power, his stated objectives, his positions against our allies, against NATO, against Ukraine, and with anti-democratic chaos agents, Russia's Putin and Hungary's Orban, we're really left to wonder what this could mean for the global order. What happens when a liberal hegemon, the liberal hegemon, turns its back on the very system it helped build? My guest today is Professor Edward Goldberg of New York University, expert on U.S. foreign policy and global economics, and author of the book The United States as Global Liberal Hegemon: How the U.S. Came to Lead the World. We discuss the importance of U.S. leadership, how the global order might change without it, and the consequences for both America and the world under a potential second Trump presidency. All right, if you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and/or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Edward, thanks for being here. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Absolutely. I've been thinking a lot lately about the global order, how it was established, what it's meant for stability in the world, or maybe to some degree some instability in the world, how it's maintained. And I suppose if the current structure is a good thing, and it feels like we might be living through a time when not only is that order threatened, but does feel like it could actually change, that the balance of power could shift. And that would mean away from the United States and maybe to some extent Europe. And I think on its face, absent any context, that doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but with context, when we consider who fills that vacuum and their motives and their governing systems and their values, et cetera, we're thinking about maybe China, maybe Russia to some degree. That is something to be concerned about. So I'm glad to have you here to talk through some of this with me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
So you've written about and you've talked about, the current global order as being dominated by, and actually probably needing the United States as a liberal hegemon. And I think maybe what we should do is start by defining what this means. So what is a hegemon? What's a liberal hegemon? And then why does the world need it?
Well, first, let's go to the terms. In my book, I say the United States, the title is the United States as the global liberal hegemon. Mm-hmm. how the U.S. came to lead the world. Hegemon comes, obviously, it's a Greek word. It comes from actually the rivalry of the city-states. It's the political power at the time as a hegemon. And liberal is an interesting word because it has nothing to do with the way it's used today. Today, it's used back and forth like a ping pong to imply that someone's either a socialist or communist, a liberal. True political science and definitely in international relations. Liberal, the meaning is from the Enlightenment period in the 17th and 18th century. And it means someone who is an individual, who believes in individualism, is as important as the government and should be given respect. So when we talk about a liberal hegemon, when we're talking about a power that believes in the rights of the individual, believes in the rights of the rule of law, and actually believes in a free enterprise system. It's basically totally back to the Enlightenment definition, not the definition of the talking heads today.
When you say that the world needs the United States as a liberal hegemon, is it because of that liberal component?
Well, no, actually, it's interesting. When I first began to write the book, the title was Who Anointed America? Mm-hmm. I'm a child of the Vietnam War. And I'm thinking to myself, why are we the liberal hegemon? What good do we do in the world? Who needs us? And who said we should be in this position? I came to the conclusion that there's no one else. We're in this position by default. The world's natural order, because of geography, because of culture, because of history, is chaos. And someone needs to rein in that chaos a bit. I don't think you can rein it in 100%, sadly. Someone needs to rein in that chaos a bit. And then if you look at who that could be, only the United States is in that position. We're in that position for several reasons. One, because we are definitely the lucky country when it comes to geography. We have the oceans on both sides, which gives us a very big sense of security. We have two friendly neighbors, as our neighbors on the border. The biggest problem we have with our neighbors is our southern border. Everybody wants to come to live here. Every other country would love to say that's the only problem with their neighbor. And you look at China and Russia. Russia is surrounded by enemies. China, except for North Korea, is surrounded by unfriendly countries. We're very fortunate that we have these two neighbors. Then we look at our geography, where unlike other countries, we're totally food self-sufficient. Now we're energy self-sufficient. We have a great river system. I know we just had a hurricane down south this week, but on the whole, we have a temperate climate. We're really, really the lucky country here. There's no other place with that advantage. China, most of its products and most of its energy has to come through the Straits of Macau, which is really a narrow body of water right below Singapore. Once again, we're free of that problem. So with those respects, we become the natural place. Added to that, unlike our adversaries, if you could call them adversaries, Russia and China, we have allies, which they really don't have. Oh, of course, you can say Iran's an ally of Russia, and China is, I don't know whether you would call it an ally of Russia or whether Russia is a vassal state of China. That's a debatable point. But we have allies, which is really, really important. So another advantage, and these allies recognize us as the hegemonic leader. It's not that we force them to recognize us, they choose to recognize us. And this is another very important factor.
So the current global order hasn't always existed. It isn't always been that the U.S. has been, a dominant force or chosen to play that role in the United States. A lot of this was born out of the aftermath of World War I, and then particularly the aftermath of World War II, this consolidation of allied powers around this idea that peace needed to be maintained at all costs. and then that evolved into, a battle between democracy and some type of autocracy, I suppose. But as what was born out of that was this U.S. hegemonic position. So could you maybe help me understand, or help us understand, how that was born out of I suppose, the ashes of World War II and what the trajectory has looked like?
Well, I think it's actually born out of the ashes of World War One.
Okay, yeah.
The U.S. decided not to join the League of Nations. We came in, we did our bit in World War One, and we went home. It was the age of U.S. unique engineering, the Edisons and the Fords. And like good engineers, we went in and thought we fixed the problem, and then we went home. That, of course, by definition, made the League of Nations weak if the largest economic power of the time was not in it. So consequently, we get to World War II. By the way, Franklin Roosevelt always realized that that was a major mistake. And it was always in his mind that the U.S. should have not withdrawn from the League of Nations. In fact, in the 1920s, he went around the country giving many, many speeches on it. So now then we have the Great Depression, and of course then we have World War II. And in the middle of World War II, Roosevelt administration does an amazing thing, which one could actually say is not only probably the beginning of U.S. being the hegemon, but it's probably the beginning, one could even trace it as the beginning of our age of globalization. In 1944, the Roosevelt administration called a global finance economic conference to deal with world trade in Brentwood Woods, New Hampshire. It's interesting. When they called this, it looked like we were winning the war, but we still hadn't won the war. And it was to revitalize the international financial system, which many people blamed for the economic conditions that were, one could say, nails on the coffin that led to World War II. Out of Bretton Woods, we have the IMF, we have the WTO, we have the World Bank, but we also have, most importantly, the U.S. becomes the world's reserve currency. So we now almost, our economic power, which before World War II, we were in a period of isolationism. Now we're saying openly we're going to economically be the power. And that was a very important thing. So I think we could trace our entry to being the hegemon, both in the beginning of World War II, where Roosevelt talks about the four freedoms in our war goals, even before we enter the war. We are actually, and we have to look at, I'm jumping around here a little bit, Lend-Lease, which happened before we entered the war. But Roosevelt said, we are going to be involved protecting our allies. We're going to ship them armaments under this very convoluted arrangement to get around the Congressional Neutrality Act. But still, we're going to ship the UK, we're going to ship the Soviet Union and China, actually, anyone else that we see as our friend that's being attacked, we're going to help them. So that was the beginning of this, with then later Bretton Woods.
So you mentioned WTO, you mentioned World Bank, and I think these are just a handful of institutions that were designed to, both administer and maintain this new kind of global world order with the United States as the tip of the spear, I suppose. But there are others, right? The United Nations and then NATO.
Of course.
Yeah. And I think if we don't parse out the differences and we just take this as a package of institutions that were designed to create and maintain a certain type of world order, there's two tracks I want to take here. One is, this, not to sound too tropey here, but with great power comes great responsibility. And I guess I wonder, to your mind.
It sounds like a Roosevelt speech.
Well, hey, I'll take that.
Right.
But, I do wonder, if we think about this as a trajectory, how well the United States has performed in living up to those responsibilities, but then also how the institutions that were designed to maintain this order have performed over time.
Okay, interesting question. So where do we begin here? Yes, I have to add to the World War II institutions, NATO and the UN. The UN is, in some ways, a fantastic organization, in some ways, a problematic organization. It was never really solidified in its formation how it would deal with big power rivalries. So the UN has been a fantastic institution in dealing with non-big power rivalries around the world. It's been a fantastic institution in dealing things with part of its subsidiary organizations, like the World Health Organization, which I know had some problems under COVID, but is generally a very well-operated organization and does really benefits the world scene. Same with its Law of the Seas. All these subsidiary organizations have done wonderful things. But its problem is the big power rivalries. The Security Council is, by definition, a failed system, actually. So, we look at the big conflicts since World War II, whether it's Vietnam or whether it's Afghanistan or any of these places, or Ukraine today. The Security Council is neutered. It can't do anything because of the veto rights of the big power. So that's where it's failure. And if we look at why the world needs a hegemon, and we begin, let's say, all the way back to 1648, to when the Westphalian treaties were signed in Europe, 10 to 30-year war, and the concept of sovereignty involved, and the concept of one country should not invade another country. Who guarantees that? After the Westphalian treaties, we had the Congress of Vienna, which Henry Kissinger wrote a lot about, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. And the Congress of Vienna, as Kissinger described, was based on peace will come about by a balance of power. So then we have the balance of power concept really fell apart in World War I. And then we have the League of Nations concept, which really still doesn't work because of the big power issue. Then during the Cold War, we get, as you might know, the great MAD theory, M-A-D, that came from John von Neumann in string theory, is the idea that we won't nuke the Soviets because they'll Soviet cities because they'll immediately nuke our cities. So mutually assured destruction became the peacekeeper. That's one. We no longer have a Soviet Union. You need basically two mutual powers for MAD. But also now what we found is big powers operate just to the level below MAD. So we know Russia invades the Ukraine, but we can only do so much because we'll get to the level of MAD. So Biden's limited. For instance, he can't say to the Ukrainians, use whatever missiles you have to hit stockpiles outside of Moscow, weapon stockpiles, because we're afraid then of Russia being nuclear. So looking at all these events and historic events, you have to say, well, who's going to set the rules? There has to be someone somewhere that says, back to Westphalia, nations can't, invade other nations. Who's going to be the rule setter? And that's the reason for the liberal hegemon. Does it always work? Absolutely not. Have we been gone off on adventures? Absolutely. Have we done things for our own domestic politics? Absolutely. Have we been caught up in history and been haunted by history and therefore made horrible decisions? Absolutely. I mean, there's all this documentation how in the early Vietnam, LBJ and Dean Rusk, they kept on thinking Munich. That's when they came into maturity. That was what was in their mind. They were trapped by history. So does this happen? Yes, because, we're not Plato's idealistic idea of a leader. We're human beings. So yes, we've made some tragic mistakes, but we've also done some wonderful things, whether it was the Marshall Plan, whether it was NATO. You can go on and on. And for instance, China, who's now for sure a rival, we let China grow up into this massive economic country. We protected its trade routes. We believe in freedom of the seas. And China's economy more or less grew under our military umbrella.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the war in Ukraine, and this might be a little afield, but I want to follow this thread a little bit, because you mentioned in a world in which we adhere to the concept of mutually assured destruction, that Biden is somewhat constrained to some degree as a rational actor, or at least his actions and his decisions are. But on the other side of that equation is Putin, right? And we would assume then that he is constrained by the same things. And in that sense, then I guess the battle becomes brinksmanship, like just how close you are to bring us to that, or how.
I think absolutely. I think absolutely.
And so my question is, as it relates to, the madness of the actor, Putin versus Biden, I guess here, maybe even Zelensky to some degree, we have to assume some rationality. But to your mind, in a world of mutually assured destruction, do you think that is as constraining today to somebody like Putin in a way that should give us some comfort? Or do you think that we live in a different world now with a shifting hegemony that might make this more dangerous?
I don't honestly think we have a shifting hegemony at this time, but I think it makes it more dangerous. It's interesting what happened on the MAD. We believe that these ideologues, the Soviets, right, total ideologues, our system will conquer your system. We total believers in their ways. MAD worked because we believed they were rational actors. I always thought that was interesting, and somewhat ironic. I don't know if it's any different now. We have to believe that they're rational actors and they don't want to kill their population, that they are not true ideologues. Iran this afternoon, now this could change in the next 5 minutes, okay, what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Iran today was a rational actor. It fired a retaliation against Israel, but it was all PR and no, major attack. Either they don't have the ability to do it, or they were just saying, for our population, we have to show that we have the ability to do something. Mm-hmm. But they appeared to be very much of a rational actor, and these are definitely a group of men that are totally ideologues.
Right. And so just for our listeners, what you're talking about is we're recording this essentially at the same moment that Iran is firing missiles at Israel.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah. So this is a little off book, but I do want to bounce something off of you, because this is what I worry about. A scenario in which, have you ever been in a room of sane people, and then there's one person who's pushing the boundary, and it's almost like that person knows they can go a little crazy because everyone else will maintain sanity?
Of course.
And that worries me, that that's the game Putin is playing, is that he could even perhaps, even if it's some low grade nuclear weapon, employ use of that strategically and assume that nobody else will want to escalate and respond in kind.
He could. I assume and hope that our intelligence services, have done different studies on Putin's psyche, Mm-hmm. I assume they have. I assume there are all types of psychological profiles that our leaders see on Putin. I hope they're correct, mm-hmm. But obviously we just don't know. And of course, then what is our position if he does something like that? I don't think we're going to advertise that either. Mm-hmm. But let's get back to, once again, how do you limit the chaos? You can't stop the chaos, okay? But how do you limit it? And that's, I think, the role today of the global liberal hegemon. Look, I think Obama, who I think was really a very good president, had made one major foreign policy mistake. He gave this when Syria used gas on its citizens. He gave a wonderful speech on national TV about how this is absolutely violates all international law. It's been a part of international law, a treaty, a convention since the end of World War One. You don't use natural gas, and Assad did. It would have been very easy for Obama to launch several missiles, not many, several missiles into Damascus to show this is a violation of the rules. For whatever reason, after this great speech, Obama didn't follow through. Mm-hmm. I think that set a bad precedent for the role of the hegemon, because the policeman needs to give out tickets. If the cop doesn't give out tickets, the cop loses all authority. Biden's position in the Ukraine is a much, much tougher position than Obama's, because obviously Syria was not going to harm us if we gave them a ticket. Biden's problem in the Ukraine is we can be harmed by giving out the ticket. So it's a much more difficult calculation. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, Biden did, and I have to give Biden a lot of credit for this, Biden did organize this great allied Western response on the invasion of Ukraine. And I think this is a tremendous job on his part.
So I feel like you answered this question earlier, but I guess I want to poke at it a little bit. Do you think that the current global order with the United States as the liberal hegemon is in flux or in danger of collapsing? And I suppose if so, what would bring that about, or what could cause that?
You know, I honestly, I was accused the other day by someone on the Council of Foreign Relations of being an optimist. But I actually, since don't think it's so much in danger. I think we have to be very leery about, looking at the forest in the trees and not just looking at the headline view of the world. I think that in principle, the United States, with its allied relationships, especially with the European Union countries, has gotten stronger. The attack on Ukraine has made that stronger. China's aggressiveness in the South China Sea and in Asia has made our relationship with the Japanese and the Filipinos and Vietnam and those countries stronger. So I think, once again, back to the fact that in today's world, the allies give the permission for one country to be the hegemon. I think that we've cemented our strength. I also see China having tremendous economic problems between aging population, between debt, and now an increasingly deflation. I see China not in a healthy position at all, which sadly could make it more aggressive. That's another story. But I don't see it, it's not the motto that everyone thought it was 8 years ago. I see the United States' ability, especially in a world where manufacturing has really declined in value and human capital. We're in a new age. It's like going from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And we've now gone from the manufacturing age to the human capital age. I think the U.S., by the personality of its people, by its entrepreneurial spirit, by having the freedom of the internet, which you don't have in a place like China, to share ideas. I think the U.S. is in an unbelievable position in the new world. So no, I don't think we are losing our hegemonic position. I think it's actually been strengthened. I also think it's been strengthened with the dollar being the reserve currency and the dollar being the currency that most of the world trades in. the Federal Reserve now has become almost like the world's central bank or the world's firehouse. Now, I think the one thing that could seriously change this, if Donald Trump becomes elected, then I think, we have to look at it totally differently. But at the moment, since Harris is ahead 2-3 points, I realize that's nothing. I think we'll stay as the global hegemon for a while.
So I'm glad this is where you're going, because I don't want to stand in opposition to you. I appreciate your optimism, but I have anxiety, and it is for this reason, which is, I think when we talk about the ability of the current global order to survive and not just survive, but thrive, we think about what our potential challenges to it exogenously. So, from the outside, and you've talked about that, and maybe you've neutralized that, right? But, this specific, I suppose, to Trump is this endogenous component to it that makes me very nervous. And that is, there's a number of prongs, but the two prongs that concern me are, we're becoming increasingly polarized and to the point that we're becoming our own worst enemies, that we can't legislate, we can't govern ourselves. We don't seem to present a united front, and all of these are vulnerabilities that can be exploited by bad actors. But the other is, while Harris is up 2 or 3 points, we are kind of staring down a coin flip here on who the president's going to be. And if Trump poses a truly grave threat to the United States' role in the global order, then that 50-50 seems like a scary percentage, or a scary, ratio.
Yeah, I can't argue with you there. I have no idea what's going to happen on election day. To take this out of the world of international politics and back to the domestic politics, my thought is, looking at it from a historical perspective, the polls are slightly off, and Harris is further ahead because of the power of the female vote. Historically, I think it's very important to remember here that the amendment for women to vote was passed throughout 1919, 1920, and shortly after, we had prohibition passed as a constitutional amendment. That was all done on the women's vote, because, not all, but a great deal of it, because at that time people were consuming much more alcohol than they do now in the United States. And there was a tremendous amount of basically wife beating. So prohibition was driven by the women's vote, and women got the vote and they went out and did something with it. I think we might be in the same position now. Now, we'll see if I'm wrong in 4 weeks, if I'm crazy or not. This I can't, judge. But I think we're undercounting the women's vote, the silent women's vote, even the silent Nikki Haley vote on this issue. So yes, we are polar. In general, we are polarized. And, if we have a problem being the hegemon, it's that polarization. And in fact, it goes back to, in the beginning of our conversation, I mentioned the word liberal comes from the Enlightenment. Well, we're the only major country born in the era of Enlightenment where the individual in Enlightenment philosophy could be considered more important than the community. And so we have part of our philosophy, what right do you have to tell me to wear a mask during a pandemic? What right does the government have to do this? Right does the government have to tell me to get an injection against the pandemic? That's part of our individual beliefs. And that individual beliefs has been fantastic for entrepreneurialism, which I mentioned before, which makes us, I think, basically almost unstoppable economically. But it's the other side of that coin is the hindrance. We're really bad at community unless we have a solid leader that can organize us in an effort. But if we were just left to ourselves, we're anti-community in today's world, where the next pandemic can be in 3 weeks or 2 weeks, where we could have just based on Chinese deflation and how bad that gets, another economic crisis where we need community, we're not so good at that.
I want to circle back to this, the threat of something like a pandemic in a few minutes. But before we get there, I want to follow up on something else you said, which is the future of the United States as the global liberal hegemon. It's a different story if Trump is elected. And I guess I'm wondering, given Trump's, at least what we can parse out from what his policy preferences seem to be, what he said, related to trade and NATO and our allies, and then also what he's done in his previous presidency, and also how he has transformed the Republican Party to be acquiescent to all of this. How do you envision this threatening the U.S.'s role as a global hegemon were he to be reelected? And what does that look like, or what could that look like?
Okay, well, you're talking to a person here who famously on Bloomberg radio, shortly after Trump was elected, say, look, I realize he's very conservative, but he's a pragmatic New York business person, so I don't know if we have anything to worry about.
How'd that work out?
Yes, so that was a great comment of mine. I think it's a definitive problem. Mitch McConnell on hegemonic foreign relations issue was the person that blocked Trump's isolationist position in the Senate. We're not going to have that man around anymore. I'm not saying Mitch McConnell's a superstar in my beliefs of what a senator should be. But on these issues, he really neutralized Trump's position. That it's a problem. It's going to be, we have to see, what the Senate will turn out to be. Whether if, the Democrats hold the Senate, maybe they'll be able to neutralize his position. I think that's all. We have no idea at the moment.
Yeah.
I know it's not healthy. Okay. It would be easier for it to be simpler. And it would be easier, honestly, for us to go back to the Cold War understanding where American partisanship stops at the seas.
At the sea, yeah. I've been thinking a lot about that lately, that it feels like a horrible thing to say, but I would almost prefer the Cold War, where it felt like the actors were, as you had previously said, much more pragmatic. And
but that's getting back, that's Make America Great Again, because yesterday always looks better. There's this great story about when Ed Koch was running for mayor of New York, and he walked along the boardwalk in Coney Island, and these older residents sitting on the park benches would say, "Mr. Mayor, please make it like it used to be." So it's the same thing. It's one of the problems we have actually is that the change is so rapid that people can't have difficulties in just adjusting to it, and therefore they want it to be like it used to be. And I believe that's part of Trump's support. That we're changing so rapidly that it's very difficult to adjust to it.
This is actually something we talked about on last week's episode, which is this concept of nostalgia kind of throwing a shroud over reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, the Cold War does look simpler, but yet I remember being in school and having practice to go under my desk
Me too.
in case we'd be nuked.
Yep. I remember that too. This is a little afield as well, but like one potential green shoot I see is I feel like it won't happen. So there's this glimmer of hope that I have that even if Republicans hold the Senate and or the House, that they may shift a bit knowing that Trump is kind of lame duck.
We have no evidence that Vance is pragmatic or rational.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree.
So, we'll see. Once again, for your listeners, tonight's the night of the vice president's debate. So we'll see more tonight. But so far in Vance's previous statements have not been rational or very pragmatic. We just don't know.
I also wonder if Vance has the same fervor of a fan base as Trump does. And I think that's what threatens Republicans so much, is that he can turn out this fan base against them. But yeah, like you said, we'll see.
Right. Yeah, I mean, by the way, if I was Harris, I would run a campaign. Well, once again, depending what happens on the debate tonight, but I would run a campaign saying, Trump is, an older man. Do you want Vance as your president?
Yeah, I was thinking that earlier today. Like, I wonder if that's coming down the pike or if
Right.
they're just missing the boat
Right.
here. But I think they could highlight much more the role that Vance could be playing.
Correct. So I think possibly the thing that would maybe also check on Trump would be the international business community that could put pressure on Trump and check him. Although the other day he went after Google, I was surprised.
Well, I'm not surprised anymore. The guy does not seem particularly rational. But hey, so you mentioned the pandemic and the very real possibility that we could experience another one at the drop of a hat at any time. Also, the hurricanes that are occurring with much more frequency attributed to climate change. And these things, global health, pandemics, climate change, also can influence the global world order. And so I guess I wonder how much thought you've given to those types of things as impacting.
Well, it's interesting. I think first I have to say, I think one of the more solid institutions in the United States is the Pentagon. More solid governmental institutions. And the Pentagon has done tremendous work on the impact of climate change in the world and what will happen, in terms of how it will change America's position in the world. And I have to give them a lot of credit for it. I would assume that all these Congress people who vote for the Pentagon budget have no concept that they're doing these studies and plans, right? Else it would not, right? But fortunately, they don't have a concept. And so the Pentagon's been a very excellent player on this. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to stop climate change, but they're making preparations how the U.S. position, where we're going to be when cities are underwater, for instance, around the world. What's that going to mean to the United States? And I think those types of scenarios are very important.
I guess I want to pin you down a little bit on not in the context of the United States as a fading power, but just given what we know about the current state of affairs globally. And it does feel like maybe it is no different from any other era, but it does feel like we are living through an era of time that is very unstable. And that doesn't have to be negative, just like that we're going through quite a few significant changes to governing styles, to alliances and relationships in the world, and migration and climate change, et cetera.
Oh, I agree. And you referenced going back to the Cold War days. I mean, look at the Eisenhower period domestically. Domestically, of course, we buried a zillion issues. We buried civil rights. We buried women's rights. We buried gay rights issues. It was all buried, very much so. But if you looked at the country, it was very pacific at the time. And you didn't feel, if you were a white, middle, upper class male especially, you felt everything's okay. But once again, I think, yes, we're going through back to the changes in the world. Just look to what's happening in the Middle East now. We're the liberal hegemon, but we can't control the Middle East. There are now so many independent actors. A bigger threat to our hegemony, to a certain extent, not to our hegemony, but the ability to control chaos, I think, is not China or Russia, but the development of individual actors.
Such as
Hezbollah or Hamas.
Right. Yeah.
Or what's going on in Yemen.
The non-state actors.
The non-state, this is much more problematic. And of course, then getting back to climate change. I mean, how this affects the world is tremendous. I mean, look at Egypt. I mean, Egypt is getting drier and drier. And interestingly enough, its revenue source, the Suez Canal, is being used less because now ships going from Asia find it shorter sailing time to go above and go through the Arctic Circle because now that pass is open for a good part of the year. So you don't have to go through the Suez Canal. So that deprives Egypt of revenue. And so between it getting hotter and less revenue, this country could easily very much eventually slip into crisis. But the Pentagon did a study several years ago, as an example, that the Syrian civil war was partly caused because of climate change, because the small Syrian farmers weren't able to get their crop yields. You had this, and it's amazing what happened. So you have the Syrian civil war. What happens? It threatens our closest ally and our largest trading partner, the European Union, because these people go to immigrate there. So it's everything becomes connected and then adds to the chaos.
So if we package all of this and consider all of this, to your mind, what are you looking for as it relates to the future of the global order in the next decade or so?
Basically, I want to be back to being a Westphalian. I want countries should not invade other countries. Stability. I think stability is the best you could ask for in a time of rapid change.
Is there anything that particularly concerns you, or do you just remain an optimist?
No, the effect, as I mentioned, the effects that climate change can have on nation states is a tremendous problem. U.S. politics, I believe, is a tremendous problem. I'm an optimist, but I'm not a 90% optimist. I'm a 52% optimist.
Hey, Harris will take that.
I know, exactly. Exactly. Good point.
Okay, final question. You ready for it?
Yes.
What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? It doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Okay. So a couple of good books.
Yep.
For those who love detective books and who love international economics, there's a great new detective book called The Wealth of Shadows by a writer, Graham Moore. Believe it or not, it's a detective story about Bretton Woods in 1944. And it's really superb. It has all the major characters like John Maynard Keynes, really describes him extremely well. It's a great book. It's fun. I'm in the middle of reading a kind of difficult but fascinating history called How the West Was Made by Dr. Josephine Corey Quinn, about how different cultures from prehistoric times came to make up what we now call Europe. She's very much saying that historically we think Europe went from Athens to Rome to what we know as Europe. And she's saying, no, there's so much more involved. I just finished a great history called Demons of Unrest by Eric Larson about the period in America from the time Lincoln was nominated to the beginning of the Civil War. Fascinating cultural study, very much relates to that to today. So that's what I've been reading.
Sounds like you and I kind of swim in the same pool of genre. I've got Demons of Unrest on the table right next to me.
Oh, it's wonderful.
And I just looked up Wealth of Shadows. I just got back from Berlin, and it looks like there's a whole Nazi Germany component to this.
Yes, slight Nazi Germany component. Yes.
I've been finding that really fascinating. It's also, like, to me, like, kind of studying history and how it all played out has been a bit of a comfort blanket as, I worry about this election. So,
right.
Yeah, that's right up my alley right now. So thanks for that.
No, it's really a great read. I mean, it's really fun. And as I said, everyone has said particular nonsense. I really spent a lot of time reading about and studying Bretton Woods, and his description of the characters are just really fantastic. So I think it's a fascinating story.
And it's a fascinating time.
Where were you in Berlin?
Well, I was just in Berlin, but I stayed near Potsdamer Platz. Do you know it?
Yeah, vaguely, yes. I was only there once. I loved it.
I really loved it too. It's a fascinating city. Germany has the 1900s were particularly interesting for Germany, but there's just so much history at every turn.
Oh, I agree. I totally agree. I totally agree.
Like, you don't have to leave that city. I spent a week there and I didn't leave the city once and had plenty to do every day, plenty to do and see. So
Right. And then when you think about it, in the 1920s, it was one of the intellectual capitals of the world.
Yep.
Under Weimar.
Yep.
Amazing place.
Yeah. And my family actually comes from there. My mom's maiden name is Brandenburg.
Oh, okay. Like the gate.
Yeah. So that was kind of, I don't know, it was a little bit special to be there.
Do you have any family, or they all left, or were all killed, or?
I have ancestry there, but I don't know any of them.
Okay.
Everybody I've talked to that's been to Berlin, even once, has said they loved it.
Also, the art scene is unbelievable.
It is. It really is. And not just really refined art.
Right. No,
Yeah.
I know what, right. Yeah,
So,
it's amazing.
Edward, thanks for being here and also for the conversation. I think it's super apropos to the time, and I enjoyed it.
Okay, I appreciate it. I appreciate you listening to me pontificate.
The United States has been the cornerstone of international stability for decades, promoting peace, democracy, and economic growth through its leadership. But with the possibility of a significant shift in American foreign policy under a second Trump presidency, the future of that leadership is at risk. A diminished United States on the global stage could lead to profound instability. Without American influence to mediate conflicts, reinforce international law, and support democratic norms, the world could see a rise in authoritarian regimes, unchecked aggression, and economic uncertainty. The alliances and institutions that have helped keep peace for the past 70 years could fray. They could collapse, leaving a power vacuum that authoritarian powers like China and Russia would be more than are eager to fill. They've already positioned themselves to exploit vulnerabilities and weaknesses. The consequences of this shift wouldn't just be felt abroad. They would reverberate back to American shores. A less engaged United States could mean weakened security, increased economic vulnerability, and the erosion of democratic values here at home. So as we head into this incredibly consequential election, for a whole host of reasons, it's crucial to recognize that one of those reasons is the importance of sustained American leadership, and to understand that global stability hinges on a strong, engaged United States. And that's all at risk. All right, check back next week for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.